The Aurora was always the laughingstock of the fleet. Among the massive, highly advanced warships that flew through the stars, it looked like a rusted relic, a ship of the past. The crew knew the truth, though. The Aurora wasn't just a ship, it was their home. And no matter how much the other fleets mocked them, they had one thing the others didn't: heart. This was a ragtag group of humans and a few alien misfits, all of them struggling to prove they were more than the fleet's leftover crew. The ship itself had been passed down through generations, long out of date, and only brought back to service because there was nowhere else to send it. Its engines sputtered at the best of times, and its weaponry was outdated by centuries. Still, the crew worked tirelessly, adjusting every system to the best of their ability. The ship's worn-out systems barely held together, and yet, day after day, they kept it moving. The Aurora's captain, Commander Evelyn Porter, stood by her crew with unwavering loyalty. She had been assigned to the ship when no other commander would take it. She had seen potential where others saw failure. There was something about the Aurora, something hidden beneath the layers of rust and ancient technology that kept her going. It was more than just stubbornness. It was something unexplainable, and it kept them all going. "All systems are running at 70%, Captain," Lieutenant Gregor said, looking at the control panel. "That's as good as we're going to get with these old engines." Porter smiled faintly. "That's more than enough for now." Outside the ship's windows, the vastness of space stretched endlessly. The fleet they were part of was a massive military force, filled with ships so powerful they could wipe entire planets from existence. Yet, in the eyes of the fleet's higher-ups, the Aurora was just a shadow. No one expected much from her, and even less from her crew. They were always assigned the least important tasks, always kept out of the real action. But that was about to change. One quiet morning, as the Aurora drifted through an uncharted section of space, a signal came through. It was faint, barely detectable, but it was there. Porter's eyes narrowed as she studied the readings. This wasn't a standard distress signal. It was something else, something unfamiliar. She stood up and walked over to the communications console. "Lieutenant, analyze that signal. What do we have here?" Gregor worked quickly, his fingers flying over the keys. "It's a distress call, but the frequency, it doesn't match any known species." A mix of curiosity and caution spread across the bridge. The rest of the crew had heard the signal too, and now everyone was waiting, trying to make sense of it. "Are we going to respond?" Gregor asked. Porter didn't hesitate. "Yes, send a message. Let's see who's out there." The Aurora wasn't equipped for real combat, but they had one thing going for them: a reputation for being overlooked. No one would ever expect this ship to take action, to go into unknown space and deal with the unexpected. That worked to their advantage. They would go to investigate, but they would do it on their terms. The distress signal continued to pulse, growing stronger as they approached the source. Hours passed, and the tension on the bridge grew. No one knew what they were about to find, but each of them could feel the change in the air. The Aurora might not be strong, but they were about to face something that could test everything they thought they knew. Eventually, they arrived at the location where the signal was coming from. A massive ship, much larger and more advanced than anything the Aurora had ever seen, loomed before them. Its dark shape was barely visible against the starry background, but it was clearly an alien vessel. The crew of the Aurora froze, staring at the ship on their screens. This wasn't just a distress call. It was an invitation into the unknown. Porter's heart raced. She had no idea what was waiting for them, but she wasn't about to turn back now. Her crew, her misfit crew, had come this far together. There was no turning back. "We're going in," Porter said, her voice steady. "Prepare for anything." The crew, though nervous, nodded in agreement. They may not have been the most powerful ship in the fleet, but the Aurora had something far stronger than weapons: its crew's will to face whatever lay ahead. As they moved closer to the alien ship, a strange feeling settled over them all. The Aurora, the weakest ship in the fleet, was about to face something that would change the course of their destiny forever. The Aurora moved cautiously toward the massive alien ship, its lights flickering weakly against the darkness of space. Every crew member stood still, eyes glued to their screens, waiting for the unknown. The bridge was silent, the usual hum of the ship's old engines, somehow more noticeable now that they were about to make contact with something far more advanced. Commander Evelyn Porter remained calm at the helm. Her hand rested on the controls, but her mind raced. She had never expected to face an alien ship so powerful, so imposing. Her crew, inexperienced in actual combat, was about to meet an unknown force, and there was no telling what would happen next. Approaching the alien ship now, Captain, Lieutenant Gregor called out, his voice tense. Porter's fingers tapped against the chair, signaling him to continue. Keep us steady. We don't know what we're dealing with yet. The alien ship loomed larger in the view screen, its surface smooth and dark, unlike anything the Aurora had ever seen. It was almost as if the ship didn't belong to any known galaxy, its design entirely foreign. Strange symbols covered its surface, glowing faintly in a pattern that seemed to shift and change. It looked alive, almost organic, but far more complex than any life form the crew could imagine. Captain, they're broadcasting a message, Gregor reported. Porter sat forward. Put it through. The alien message was a strange mix of sounds and symbols, impossible for any of them to fully understand. It was a language they had never encountered before, but there was something in the tone, an urgency they could feel even through the static. Can you translate it? Porter asked. Gregor shook his head. No, Captain. It's beyond our current technology. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. They couldn't communicate, couldn't even begin to understand what the aliens wanted. Still, they had come this far, and backing down now wasn't an option. Suddenly, the alien ship's massive engines powered up. A shockwave blasted through the Aurora, shaking the old ship violently. Crew members stumbled, and alarms blared as the Aurora's systems struggled to stay online. The sudden attack was unexpected. Too fast, too sudden. We're under fire, Lieutenant Kayla shouted, her fingers flying over the controls as the ship rocked with another violent hit. Shields are at 20% and dropping. Porter's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. Prepare to return fire. Do everything you can to stabilize the ship. She turned to her communications officer. Send out a distress signal to the fleet. We need backup now. The crew scrambled to react, fighting to keep the Aurora alive, while the alien ship continued to launch attack after attack. The Aurora wasn't equipped to fight back. Its weapons were outdated, its shields barely functional. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming force, the crew didn't falter. Lieutenant Gregor, Porter said, keeping her eyes on the battle. Can we do anything with the ship's systems? Any weaknesses we can exploit? Gregor stared at his panel, working quickly. There's a problem with their power system, he said, his voice tinged with excitement. I can try to hack their communications and cause a power overload. Do it, Porter barked. For a few tense moments, the ship continued to shake under the constant assault. Every crew member fought with all their might, unwilling to surrender. And then, Gregor's fingers slammed down on the controls. I've got it, Gregor yelled. I've triggered their power overload. A moment later, the alien ship's engines sputtered, and a bright flash of light burst from their side. The ship veered off course, its attacks momentarily stopped. The crew of the Aurora had scored a temporary victory. We've got a chance, Kayla called, her voice filled with a new sense of hope. Porter wasted no time. All power to forward weapons. Let's take advantage of their momentary weakness. The Aurora fired its old, weakened cannons, but in the chaos of the battle, they hit their target. The alien ship's shields faltered, and a massive explosion rocked its hull. It wasn't a crippling blow, but it was enough to give the crew of the Aurora a glimmer of hope. They weren't done yet. As the alien ship began to recover, it fired once more, this time with more precision. The Aurora dodged as best as it could, but another hit struck the hull, sending the ship into a violent spin. For a moment, it seemed like the battle was lost. The Aurora was outmatched, outgunned, and out of options. But Commander Porter wasn't ready to give up. She stood tall, eyes fierce with determination. "We don't retreat," she said to her crew. "We fight. We've come this far, and we're not going to let some alien force decide our fate." With a deep breath, she looked to her crew. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We'll find a way to win this, together." The crew, though shaken, nodded in unison. They were ready. The weakest ship in the fleet had been pushed to the edge. But now, it was starting to fight back. And it would take more than firepower to defeat the Aurora. The Aurora was not out of danger, but the tide had begun to shift. Despite the alien ship's superior firepower, the crew of the Aurora was proving that they had something far more important than advanced weaponry: creativity, courage, and the will to survive. Commander Evelyn Porter stood at the helm, her eyes fixed on the view screen. The alien ship was regrouping, attempting to recover from the damage they'd inflicted. The Aurora's hull was scared and battered, but they were still flying. For now, that was enough. "Status report," Porter called. "Shields are at 10% and dropping." Lieutenant Kayla replied, her voice strained. "We've sustained damage to the aft engines, but the forward guns are still functional, Captain." "Good," Porter said, her mind racing. "Keep those guns aimed at their weak spots. We need to buy more time." The Aurora had never been designed for combat, but the crew had made the most of its outdated technology. They were using every trick in the book, every ounce of energy, to keep the ship in the fight. The alien ship, a sleek and powerful behemoth, was not going down without a fight. Its massive engines hummed as it began to turn, its weapons ready to fire once more. But this time, the Aurora was ready. As the alien ship launched another barrage of energy blasts, Porter gave the order. "All power to engines. Evasive maneuvers, now." The Aurora lurched as its engines roared to life, the ship dodging to the left, just as the alien ship's attack hit nothing but empty space. The alien ship fired again, but this time, the Aurora was already moving in a different direction. For a few precious moments, the Aurora was no longer an easy target. "We're holding our own," Lieutenant Gregor shouted, grinning at the controls. Porter allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The Aurora was small, agile, and surprisingly tough. And now, for the first time, it wasn't just surviving, it was fighting back. The alien ship's attacks were becoming less frequent, its weapons systems flickering as if something was beginning to fail. "Captain, the enemy ship's shields are weakening," Gregor said, his voice excited. "I think we can make a direct hit now." Porter's eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. The alien ship was growing more erratic, its movements more desperate. This was their chance. Target their main reactor. If we hit that, it could disable their whole ship. Kayla, her hands moving quickly, relayed the orders to the weapons systems. "Firing now, Captain." The Aurora's old weapons fired with a loud boom, and for the first time, they seemed to connect. A blast of energy hit the alien ship directly in its power core. The alien vessel shook violently as sparks flew from its hull. The shields collapsed completely. "Direct hit," Kayla shouted. "We've breached their core." The alien ship reeled, but it wasn't done yet. In a last-ditch attempt, it fired its remaining weapons at the Aurora with everything it had left. The Aurora lurched again, taking a massive blow. Sparks flew across the bridge as the ship rocked from the impact. But the crew held on, determined to see it through. "All systems failing," Gregor said, his voice strained as he worked to keep the ship in the fight. "The rear engine is critical, Captain. We need to get out of here before we lose propulsion." Porter gripped the edge of the command console, her eyes focused on the view screen. The alien ship was listing, its engines failing, and its weapons were gone. It was clear now. The Aurora had won this battle. "Get us out of here," Porter ordered. "Full speed ahead. We've done what we can. Let's move before that ship falls apart." As the Aurora turned to flee, the alien ship behind them began to break apart. Its engines sputtered and exploded in a burst of light, sending debris flying into the dark void of space. The battle had been won, not through strength, but through sheer determination. The crew of the Aurora stood in stunned silence as the enemy ship's remains drifted away. It wasn't just that they had survived. They had done what everyone thought was impossible. They had turned the tables on an enemy that had outmatched them in every way. "We did it," Kayla said softly, still processing the reality of the victory. Porter exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the battle lift from her shoulders. "We did it together." The crew let out a cheer, their faces lighting up with relief. They had faced certain destruction, but they had refused to back down. They had turned the weakest ship in the fleet into a nightmare for their enemies. But even as the crew celebrated their hard-won victory, Porter's mind was already moving forward. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The alien ship they had destroyed was part of something bigger, a force that was still out there, watching, waiting. The Aurora had made a powerful statement, but it was only the beginning. Porter turned to her crew, her eyes fierce with determination. "We're not finished yet. We've just begun." The crew of the Aurora had barely caught their breath when an alarm blared across the bridge. The ship's weakened systems flickered in and out, but they were still operational. Barely. "Captain, we've received a transmission," Gregor called out, his voice tense. Porter immediately turned to the communication panel. After a battle like that, she expected more threats. She didn't think they were done yet. "Put it through," she ordered. The screen flickered, and a familiar alien face appeared. It was one of the alien commanders from the ship they had just destroyed. The figure's face was stern, almost emotionless, but its eyes gleamed with a sense of cold fury. "You have made a grave mistake, humans," the alien said, its voice low and threatening. "You may have won this battle, but you've awakened something far worse." Porter's heart skipped a beat. She had known it wasn't over, but hearing the alien speak only confirmed her worst fears. "What do you mean?" Porter demanded, keeping her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. The alien's expression hardened, its eyes narrowing. "You think we were the only ship you could defeat? No, you've stirred the wrath of our entire fleet. You've awakened the Korak." The name struck Porter like a blow to the chest. She had heard of the Korak, a race of war-hardened aliens known for their ruthless campaigns. Their ships were the stuff of legend, and not in a good way. They were said to be merciless and terrifying, and they had never been defeated. "Why?" Porter asked, her voice a little shaky. "Why target us?" The alien commander's gaze softened slightly, though not with kindness. "You've shown us that humans are not weak. You have taken down our ship. That means you can fight, and that is why you are now a target. The Korak cannot allow such a challenge to remain. We will destroy you, and we will destroy all humans." Porter clenched her fists. "We're not afraid of you. We're not backing down." The alien sneered, as if to mock her words. "You will be. You will see. The Korak do not lose. And soon, your fleet will be nothing but dust." With that, the transmission cut off. Silence filled the bridge, heavy with the weight of the alien's words. For a moment, no one spoke. The crew had just defeated an enemy that had seemed unbeatable, yet the commander's warning made it clear that the true battle was only just beginning. Porter took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We've got work to do." Gregor looked at her, his expression tense. "Captain, if the Korak are really coming, we're going to need more than just our guns. We need to warn the fleet. We need to prepare." Porter nodded. "I know. Get to the comms. Let's get the word out." Kayla turned to the engineering console. "Our shields are at critical levels, Captain. I can try to boost the power, but it won't last long." "We'll make it last," Porter said. "Do whatever you can. We need to stay alive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. As Kayla worked on the systems, Porter turned to her navigation officer. Lieutenant, plot a course back to the fleet. We need to get there fast. Aye, Captain, Gregor replied. But the Korak could be anywhere. We need to be ready for an ambush. Porter stared at the view screen, her mind racing. The Aurora was outclassed. It wasn't meant for a war against such a powerful force. But the crew had proven time and time again that they could outsmart and outlast any challenge. They would do it again. The ship's engines hummed to life as they began to move, but as they turned away from the wreckage of the alien ship, the Aurora shook. The sensors began to flash with warnings. Captain, Kayla shouted, her voice filled with panic. They're here. The Korak ships are coming. Porter's heart raced. The Korak had arrived faster than she expected. They hadn't wasted any time. The Aurora's crew could barely get a message out to warn the fleet, but it didn't matter. The battle was already on. The view screen flashed to life, and the Korak ships appeared, massive and imposing, surrounding them from every direction. There were dozens of them, far more than the Aurora could handle. This is it, Gregor said, his voice barely a whisper. There's no way we can survive this. But Porter didn't hesitate. She gripped the edge of her command chair, her voice sharp and clear. We've been counted out before. They're underestimating us again. We won't go down without a fight. Her crew exchanged glances, and for the first time, they were no longer afraid. The Korak had made a grave mistake, one that would cost them dearly. All hands, brace for impact. Porter shouted, her eyes locked on the incoming enemy ships. We are not going down today. The Aurora shuddered as the first wave of Korak fire struck. The ship's shields flared brightly, holding up against the intense barrage. But the strain was clear. The ship groaned under the pressure. Captain Porter's knuckles turned white as she gripped the command chair. We can't take much more of this, Kayla shouted from the engineering console. Shields are at 40%. We need to maneuver. Porter didn't hesitate. Helm, evasive maneuvers, now, she barked. The Aurora lurched as Gregor slammed his hands onto the controls. The ship twisted and turned, narrowly avoiding another blast that hit their aft section. Sparks flew across the bridge, and the lights flickered dangerously. The crew's faces were tight with concentration as they worked together, each one aware that this could be their last moment. The enemy ships were enormous, each one towering over the Aurora. The Korak fleet had them surrounded, and they were relentless, bombarding the Aurora from all angles. But the crew wasn't backing down. They knew they had one chance to survive, by fighting back. Captain, we're being targeted by their main guns, Gregor warned. If we don't do something soon, we'll be destroyed before we can even fire back. Porter's mind raced. The Aurora wasn't built for this kind of battle. It was smaller and slower than the Korak ships, but they had one advantage: the element of surprise. The Korak thought they were facing a weak, crippled ship. What they didn't know was that the humans aboard had learned how to turn the ship into a weapon, despite its broken systems. We're not going down without a fight, Porter muttered under her breath. Captain, Gregor's voice was sharp, pulling Porter from her thoughts. We've got a solution. We can overload the secondary weapon systems. It will give us a massive energy surge, enough to break through their shields and hit their weak points. Porter's eyes narrowed. It was a risky move. Overloading the weapons systems could tear the ship apart. But if they didn't act fast, they wouldn't make it to another round. Do it, she ordered. We don't have any other choice. Kayla quickly worked her console, sweat beading on her forehead. Warning. Systems at 80%. We're running out of time. Hold on, Gregor yelled, his hands flying over the navigation controls. The ship lurched again, dodging another wave of fire. The seconds felt like hours as the crew held their breath. Then, with a loud hum, the ship's secondary weapons systems flared to life. A massive energy pulse shot from the Aurora, slamming into the nearest Korak ship. The enemy's shields flickered and sparked, unable to absorb the force of the blast. The Korak ship rocked back, struggling to stay in formation. Yes, Kayla cheered. It worked. Their shields are down. The crew let out a collective breath. They had struck first. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Captain, the other ships are regrouping, Gregor warned. We're still outnumbered. They're coming in again. Porter knew they didn't have long before the Korak regrouped. But now, they had a chance. A spark of hope had been lit. If they could break through the Korak defenses, they could make it to the fleet. They could warn them. They could win. Kayla, rear out power to the forward guns, Porter ordered. Let's finish this. Aye, Captain, Kayla replied, her fingers flying over the console. The Aurora's forward cannons came online, and the ship fired again. This time, the blast was even more powerful. The Korak ships staggered, their shields flickering as the pulse hit. Another explosion rocked one of the enemy vessels, sending debris scattering into space. The Korak ship was crippled, its engines sputtering out of control. They're retreating, Gregor exclaimed. Porter allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The Korak had been caught off guard. The humans had done what was thought to be impossible. They had fought back. But there was still so much to do. Stay alert, Porter said, her voice steady. They'll come back stronger. We need to get to the fleet and warn them. Kayla looked at the damage reports, her face grim. Captain, we've taken heavy damage. I don't know if we can make it back to the fleet in one piece. Porter's eyes met hers, full of determination. We don't have a choice. We've taken down one ship. We can do it again. With the Korak retreating for now, the crew of the Aurora set a course for the fleet. They were battered, bruised, and running low on resources, but their spirits were high. They had fought back against impossible odds. They had proven the strength of the human spirit. And they weren't done yet. The Aurora's engines hummed, struggling to maintain speed. The ship had been heavily damaged during the battle, and it felt like the crew was pushing the very limits of its systems. Still, there was no turning back. Captain Porter knew they had one last chance to make a real difference. We're almost there, she said, her voice steady as she glanced at the view screen. In the distance, she could see the glowing outline of the fleet. The human ships were in formation, waiting for the signal to engage the enemy. But the Korak fleet was regrouping, their massive warships closing in fast. Captain, the engines can't take much more of this, Gregor warned from the helm. We're running on fumes. We'll make it, Porter replied firmly, her hands gripping the armrests of the command chair. We have to. Kayla, the ship's chief engineer, was working furiously at her station. We've patched up the damage as much as we can, but we're still leaking power. Shields are at 30%, and the secondary systems are unstable. Porter exhaled slowly, thinking of the risks. The Korak had underestimated them before, but now they were aware of the Aurora's resilience. The battle was about to get even harder, and this time, the Korak would not make the same mistake. Stay sharp, everyone, Porter ordered. We need to hold them off long enough for the fleet to engage. We don't get another shot at this. Outside the view screen, the Korak ships were closing in, their weapons charging. The Aurora's shields flickered, and sparks flew from the console. Kayla worked furiously to stabilize the systems, but the ship was on the edge of falling apart. We've got incoming fire, Gregor shouted. Prepare for impact. The Aurora shook as a volley of Korak blasts hit their shields. The energy pulses surged through the ship, rattling the crew to their core. For a moment, it felt as if the ship would break in half. The lights flickered, and the hum of the engines grew weaker. We're not going to survive another hit like that. Kayla yelled, her hands flying over the controls in a desperate attempt to stabilize the ship. Porter's mind raced. They had to do something, or they wouldn't make it. The Korak were relentless, and they had superior firepower. But the Aurora had one advantage that the Korak hadn't counted on: its crew. They had learned to turn the ship into something more than a wreck. The Aurora might not be the strongest ship, but its people were strong, and together they had turned it into a force to be reckoned with. "Gregor, take us in close to their flagship," Porter ordered. "We need to get their attention. Now." Gregor didn't hesitate. He adjusted the helm, sending the ship into a sharp turn. The Aurora darted through the firestorm, weaving between enemy ships. The Korak fleet was taken off guard, their ships unable to lock onto the smaller, faster Aurora. "Target their engines," Porter commanded. "We need to cripple their flagship." Kayla quickly adjusted the power flow, channeling everything they had left into the primary weapon systems. "Weapons online, Captain. But we've only got one shot at this." Porter looked up at the view screen. The enemy flagship loomed large ahead, a massive fortress in space. Its shields were strong, but not invincible. The Aurora had one chance to hit it in its weakest point: the engines. If they could disable the flagship, the rest of the Korak fleet would fall into disarray. "Fire!" Porter shouted. The Aurora fired a powerful energy beam, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The beam cut through the void of space, striking the flagship dead center. There was a blinding flash of light as the Korak ship shields cracked. For a moment, the enemy fleet hesitated. "Yes," Kayla shouted. "Their engines are down. They're disabled." The Korak flagship now drifted helplessly in space, its powerful weapons useless. The rest of the fleet hesitated, unsure of what to do next. It was their moment. "Now's our chance," Gregor shouted. The Aurora pushed forward, its remaining weapons systems firing at full capacity. The Korak fleet was disorganized, their ships unable to form the cohesive front they had before. The Aurora darted between them, taking out one ship after another with precision shots. The Korak were reeling, caught off guard by the unexpected resistance. "We're winning," Porter muttered under her breath. It didn't seem real. The weakest ship in the fleet had turned the tide of the battle. The humans had done the impossible, and now the Korak were on the back foot. But there was no time to celebrate. The battle was still ongoing, and they had to finish what they started. "We finish this now," Porter said with determination. "Full power to the guns. We need to wipe them out before they regroup." The crew of the Aurora pressed on, pushing their damaged ship to its absolute limits. They had faced impossible odds, and yet they were still standing. The battle was far from over, but they had one thing the Korak didn't: hope. And as long as they had that, they would keep fighting. The Aurora drifted through the smoke and debris of the battlefield. The once mighty Korak fleet was now in shambles. Their flagship, crippled and drifting in space, was a symbol of their failure. And standing in the middle of it all was the Aurora, battered and bruised, but still standing strong. Captain Porter stood at the helm, her eyes fixed on the view screen. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The Korak fleet had been shattered, their advance halted, but there were still pockets of resistance. The Aurora was damaged, its systems strained, but it had accomplished what no one thought possible. It had turned the tide of the war. "We did it," Gregor said, his voice low with disbelief. "We really did it." Porter allowed herself a small smile. She had been a leader in the darkest of times, and now, for the first time in a long while, there was hope. But she knew better than to think victory had come easy. They had fought with everything they had, and they had come close to losing everything. Still, they had prevailed. The ship's lights flickered as Kayla worked frantically to stabilize the systems. "Captain, I've rerouted power to the main systems, but we're not going to get far with what we have left. We need repairs." Porter nodded, understanding the situation all too well. "We'll make do. For now, we have a battle to finish." Outside, the remaining Korak ships regrouped. They were wounded, disorganized, but they weren't giving up just yet. The Aurora was low on fuel, its weapon systems barely functioning, but it had one advantage the Korak did not: its crew. and its crew had shown time and time again that they could accomplish the impossible. "Ready the weapons, Kayla," Porter ordered. "We're not finished yet." Kayla gave a quick nod, her fingers flying over the controls. The ship's weapon systems hummed, though they were far from their peak performance. Still, they would have to do. The Orc ships approached cautiously, aware that the Aurora was damaged. They tried to regroup, but the humans were relentless. The Aurora might have been the weakest ship in the fleet, but it had become a symbol of defiance. It had earned the respect of its enemies, even if they hated to admit it. Porter gripped the armrests of her chair. "This is it. Let's end this." The Aurora darted forward, the last of its weapons firing in short, precise bursts. Despite their best efforts, the Korak couldn't match the speed and agility of the human ship. One by one, their remaining ships were taken down. It wasn't just power that won this fight. It was determination, strategy, and the courage to keep going when everything seemed lost. "Captain, we've cleared the last of them," Gregor reported, his voice full of disbelief. "The Korak fleet, they're gone." Porter sat back in her chair, letting out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "It's over," she said softly. "We won." The crew of the Aurora erupted into cheers. After weeks of fighting, of uncertainty, they had done the impossible. They had turned the weakest ship in the fleet into a nightmare for their enemies. But even as the cheers rang out, Porter knew the war wasn't over. The Korak would regroup, they would rebuild, but they would remember the Aurora, and they would remember the humans who had fought with everything they had to stop them, and that memory would haunt them for a long time. The Aurora wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of the strength that humanity could muster in the face of overwhelming odds. It had faced impossible challenges, had been knocked down time and time again, but it had never given up. And that, more than anything, had turned it into a nightmare for the Korak. Porter turned to her crew, a proud smile on her face. "We did it together," she said, her voice filled with pride. "No matter how small we were, we showed the universe what humanity is capable of." Kayla nodded. "We'll rebuild, and next time, we'll be even stronger." Porter looked out into space, the stars stretching endlessly before them. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over, and the crew of the Aurora was ready for whatever came next. They had shown the Korak that humanity wasn't something to be underestimated, that even the weakest ship in the fleet could become a nightmare. And now, they had the confidence to face whatever challenges the universe had in store. The Aurora may have been the weakest ship, but it had proven that with courage, ingenuity, and the strength of its crew, it could overcome any obstacle. And the Korak would never forget that.